The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by a CGSP Southeast Asia editor, Antonia Timmerman from Jakarta, Indonesia. A very good afternoon to you, Antonia.
Good afternoon, Eric.
Antonia, at the time of our recording now, you still do not have a new president in Indonesia, although we're getting closer. It looks like Prabowo Subianto is going to be the next leader of Indonesia. An election took place last week, and there's a lot of anticipation that, of course, he and the vice president, who is the current president's son, are going to soon take office. It's taking a little bit longer than many people had expected, I think, at least for those of us on the outside, for an announcement to be made. But already we're starting to see the positioning of the major powers in trying to court Prabowo and also to position themselves for when he will eventually be named. Just this weekend, Chinese ambassador to Jakarta, Lu Kang, paid a visit to the president-in-waiting's residence and got a chance to take some pictures with Prabowo and also posed with his cat, which I thought was very interesting. Tell us a little bit about right now where we are in the process in terms of what's the status of the election.
So you were right. As you mentioned, it is taking a little bit of time to officially announce Prabowo as the winner of this year's election. So according to many quick counts and early counts showed by the polls, Prabowo is leading by 58% of the votes. So it's looking like he won by landslide. But the reason why so many people are holding off from congratulating him outright or declaring Prabowo as the winner is because there's a lot of fraud allegations during the election. And this is why a lot of people are still, being cautious.
That being said, the Chinese Foreign Ministry has come out quite quickly and congratulated the Indonesians on what they called a successful election. I understand that the United States and some other governments have held back. And what do you guys think on the ground in terms of people acknowledging the election before it's actually even been announced and the results are finalized?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that China is one of the first people who personally congratulated Prabowo. As you said, he even visited his private home, took a picture with the cat. I mean, visually already we are getting the message that they're trying to show that they are on a friendly ground. They don't care too much about formalities. I think that is very on brand with the image that Jokowi's administration has been giving out for the last 10 years. It's just let's cut through the frills and get down to business, that kind of image. So that's one. And then the second thing, China congratulating Prabowo immediately and directly rather than waiting for the official results like what the US is doing right now. Is to show that China wants to get a head start, like what you said in the column today, right? And I think China thinks it's better to show Prabowo their enthusiasm now rather than later.
And I think for a lot of people who are unfamiliar with Indonesia, and this is a country, and I don't mean to be disrespectful in any way, Antonia, but you're a country in many respects that's enormous, has huge resources, yet at the same time does not always live up to a major power status in a regional context. It's the, I think, fourth largest country in the world in terms of population. It is the largest market in Southeast Asia. It's a massive resource exporter and a massive energy exporter to other countries here in Southeast Asia. So the importance really can't be overstated. It's also the birthplace of the non-aligned movement back in 1955 in Bandung. And so politically, it's very important in the global south. But again, it doesn't really get front page news. Now, though, because of the US-China competition here in Southeast Asia and the fact that Lu Kang, the ambassador from China, went on Sunday, took those pictures, I thought it was interesting that Prabowo allowed the Chinese to come in on that Sunday, and instead saying, you know what, let's just wait until everything is done. Because again, there's this question of the optics that Indonesia wants to be non-aligned. It wants to be the leader of the non-aligned movement. And it wants to really play both the United States and China as equal partners, not to weigh one more than the other. However, when they do this, where they publish pictures of the Chinese ambassador with the cat on Prabowo's X page, it doesn't seem that way, at least to the outside observer. And so talk to us a little bit about this idea of how Indonesia, there's a real movement inside the country to stay out of the US-China competition.
Everybody thinks Prabowo is going to be the second Jokowi, because Prabowo had used this a lot in his campaign. He repeatedly promised that he would do whatever it takes to continue Jokowi's policies. So naturally, everybody expects that he would try to keep both the US and China happy, like Jokowi had said for the last 10 years. And we know that Jokowi was always talking about finding that balance, maintaining that non-alignment policy, and then, hedging policy for our economic interests. But we also know, judging from these last 10 years, that it's easy to talk, but it's not that easy to do. Because no matter how much Jokowi tried to convince the US or the EU or Japan that Indonesia is open to everybody, they always say, oh, nobody gets special treatment. To me, it just falls through somehow. Like, for example, with the high-speed rail, we actually already managed to offend the Japanese by picking China in the end, after all that feasibility studies that the Japanese had done for us. And then we tried to approach Tesla to open a factory in Indonesia. And that one also failed. So talking is easy, but the real challenge is how do you really get there and to actually be what you have said you want to be. And now we are seeing Prabowo, and I'm really not sure how Prabowo can achieve what Jokowi had failed to achieve in the 10 years that he was president, especially given that Prabowo is not an economic person. He is more of a defense and security guy. So I don't think he knows much about pulling investment, particularly in an increasingly challenging environment. So if we're talking about nickel, for example, we know that we really need to gain access to the Western markets, for example, to absorb our nickel. So we really do need that US-China balance in all sectors across the industries, but I don't know how Prabowo will be able to achieve that.
Let's get to nickel in a second, because that's very important, particularly as it relates to the Chinese. You've heard Antonia talk about Jokowi, and Jokowi, for those of you who are not familiar, is the current president, and his son, again, is on the ticket of the new president. So his son is now the vice president in waiting. We can't say vice president-elect yet because the official results have not come out. And then also the fact that Prabowo is the current defense minister. And just before we went on air today, you were telling me that Prabowo trained with the Americans back in the day. And I thought that was really interesting because, again, it shows the deep institutional ties between the U.S. and Indonesian militaries. But to your point, though, is that the president of Indonesia, in many ways, is a salesperson who has to generate foreign direct investment, has to generate these mining partnerships and whatnot. So it will be interesting. You raised that fascinating point about whether or not his background in military affairs will translate into the salesman-in-chief in order to attract and to mitigate the tensions between the U.S. and China, particularly as it comes to investment and economic engagement.
That's right. I think if Prabowo stays on Jokowi's predictable course, I think economically we'll stay close to China. But on the defense sector, like we mentioned before, because he was in the military, I think we'll have more engagement with the West. Although for this last bit, if the security cooperation expands with the West, I'm pretty sure it will come under fire domestically, since a lot of people will say, perhaps it's not a good look for a country that supports Palestine to work with the West in defense and security sector. So let's see what he will do.
It's interesting because Prabowo ran on a platform of trying to elevate Indonesia's status in Asia to become what he called an Asian power. And in many respects, though, that could be problematic for Indonesia, especially if that pushes Indonesia up against the Chinese in places like the South China Sea or elsewhere in the military space as well. Alicia Garcia Herrero, who's a well-known China watcher out of Hong Kong, she wrote a fascinating column, which I'll put in the show notes today, Indonesia's Post-Election Balancing Act, speaking about this question of whether or not Prabowo can expand Indonesia's sphere of influence without bumping up against the Chinese. Just to refresh everybody, Indonesia is very far away from China, but yet there are still some territorial disputes that occur between the Chinese and the Indonesians. I think it's Natuna Island. Is that correct?
Natuna Island.
Can you tell us a little bit about what those disputes are between the Chinese and the Indonesians are at Natuna Island?
Actually, if we're talking about the South China Sea dispute, Indonesia doesn't have that much of a stake compared to the other claimant countries. So Natuna Island happens to be this one island on the border of northern Indonesia that is really close to the South China Sea disputed area. So when it comes to South China Sea, I think Prabowo will definitely want to project a strongman image. When it comes to Natuna Island sovereignty, he will probably use strong words. He said before in the presidential debate that, he plans to use satellite patrols, and he wants to strengthen our defense in that Natuna territory. So he wants to appear that he is not afraid of China and that he will do whatever it takes to protect our territory. And he will keep up this image for the domestic audience, at least, because that is just his main appeal to his supporter base. So if he suddenly changes tone, that will be really out of character for Prabowo. But realistically, I'm not sure how he will try to do that. He will probably try to engage with China about this in close bilateral meetings. But other than that, I really have no idea how Prabowo will approach the issue within the ASEAN context, let's say. He has not said anything about ASEAN in the debate. So people are doubting as well if he sees ASEAN as a useful tool for the South China Sea dispute or if ASEAN will be a priority for Indonesia.
Yeah, hard to see that he's going to really push the Chinese hard on Natuna just because it doesn't seem like there's a lot of payoff domestically for him on that. The downside risk seems much higher than any upside gain he could get from really confronting the Chinese, much the same way that the Philippines is taking the issue to the Chinese and really caught in a pretty nasty dispute right now. Let's switch our focus to nickel, as you mentioned. Indonesia is the Saudi Arabia of nickel. It is the largest nickel producer in the world with the largest known reserves. About 22% of the world's known reserves are in Indonesia. Nickel is something that's used to make steel, but it also, an output of nickel is cobalt as well. So when we talk about these battery metals that go into electric vehicle batteries to power Teslas and BYDs around the world, Indonesia becomes very important. Give us a little bit of background on the role that Chinese mining companies have had in Indonesia's nickel sector, and then we'll dive into whether or not that's going to be a problem with the new U.S. law called the Inflation Reduction Act. Let's first talk about a little bit of background about China and the Indonesian nickel sector.
So Indonesia has been a big nickel exporter for decades, but historically we've been exporting nickel for stainless steel production. And then in the last few years, as the world wants to move further with the green transition, especially in the transportation sector, we realized that we will need a lot of nickel to produce batteries for electric vehicles. So that's why Jokowi created this export ban in 2020, basically to hold nickel and to make sure that we process all of our nickel within Indonesian borders to become batteries for electric vehicles. And then in responding to that export ban, China actually invested a lot in our nickel industry. The promise that China has was to help us to become a battery producer in the world. So China put a lot of investment into our nickel sector to process the nickel ores into intermediary nickel products. So that is where China's presence is really big in Indonesia right now.
So in many ways, Indonesia was a pioneer in what you talked about in terms of nationalizing these resources to make sure that they were processed domestically before being exported. So they stopped the raw export of nickel. And what made that so interesting was that it was the first major mineral exporting country in the developing world to do that. And it has set an example for Zimbabwe, for Namibia, for other countries that want to emulate what Indonesia has done. How would you assess the success of this initiative of processing raw nickel domestically prior to export? Has it been effective?
It has not been that successful as much as we would like it to be, unfortunately. I talked to a lot of analysts and observers, and most of them have the same opinion. A couple of weeks ago, I talked to this analyst, Krishna Gupta. He's been following the critical minerals development and China's involvement for a while. And basically, he said there's a possibility that Indonesia will be stuck. It's going to be impossible for Indonesia to continue moving up the chain as Jokowi had promised that we would, without the US and without the EU. So the problem that we are facing right now is that we really need to gain access to the Western markets to absorb our nickel for our nickel batteries to sell. Otherwise, as I mentioned, right now we are producing intermediary nickel products and export them to China. And that's it. So these products will still need to be processed further before they can be made into batteries. And we cannot do that yet within the country, so we send them abroad. And with how things are going right now, we don't have access to the necessary markets. We will continue to do this for the foreseeable future, and we won't be able to do it all the way to producing the batteries and let alone the cars. So most analysts are sharing this view of that it's very unlikely for Indonesia to catch up with the global battery production, essentially.
Yeah, so the big problem that you've referenced, which is very interesting, is that the United States Inflation Reduction Act, which the Biden administration signed into law a couple of years ago, has a stipulation in it. And there's a very important acronym here that everybody needs to start to know and learn about. FOEC, Foreign Owned Entity of Concern. And that is a stipulation in the Inflation Reduction Act, known as the IRA, that says basically an FOEC is, well, that's French for China. And that basically says that any Chinese entity that touches any part of the battery metal supply chain or the EV supply chain will disqualify a U.S. automaker from the $7,500 tax credit, which really puts a lot of the vehicles out of reach. And a lot of U.S. automakers don't want to be in violation of the IRA because they want to be able to capitalize on that $7,500 tax credit. The problem in Indonesia, as we're hearing from Antonia, is that so much of the supply chain of the processing, the mining, and the refining, and all of that that's happening in the nickel supply chain in Indonesia has Chinese entities at somewhere along the way in that supply chain, which then takes them out of the competition to compete into the U.S. market. But, Antonia, I guess one of the key questions, you're looking into a data set right now of Chinese and all of the entities active in nickel mining. And one of the things you're finding is that it's pretty hard to determine the ownership of these different mines and refineries and smelters. So is it possible, though, that the Chinese could actually conceal their role in the Indonesian nickel sector in order to circumvent some of the sanctions that the United States has in place?
I cannot say that the Chinese are concealing their identity by purpose. Really cannot say that, unfortunately.
Okay, but let's go back. It's not that they're doing it on purpose. I mean, you've stated that the source tracing the identity of these companies is very difficult. So it's not whether they're doing it on purpose or not, but it's actually this that it is a fact that it's hard to determine the origin of the companies, right?
That's right. In trying to find the real identities of the companies, it's often that a project is listed as an Indonesian project. But then if you take a closer look and if you try to really trace the ownership of the project, you will find that the parent company of that project will often be a Chinese company or a company based in China or Hong Kong.
Okay. So that could be one challenging aspect for the United States, is to determine the origin of the companies that are involved in the Indonesian supply chain. The second problem, though, that you've been talking about in some of your recent reporting is the fact that nickel is now increasingly frowned upon in a lot of the battery process. So more and more, they're going to lithium phosphate batteries, LFPs, if I have that right. But those are nickel-free and oftentimes cobalt-free batteries. So there's a possibility, too, that the demand for nickel will remain quite low given the technology is moving beyond nickel-based batteries.
So the challenge from new technologies such as the LFP will always be there. But I think the analysts that I spoke to, they all agree that the growth for nickel-based batteries will always be high. So the growth is there, the opportunity is there. It's just a matter of how we are going to capture it. For example, for Indonesia right now, there are a number of reasons why we are failing, so to speak, in achieving our nickel to battery dream. First of all, is because the EV adoption in Indonesia is still very low. So there's no incentives for investors to build their battery and manufacturing plants over here. And then to top that, there are a lot of confusing government policies. For example, recently the government gave incentives for all EV makers to access Indonesia's market and to build their manufacturing plants here. The problem is the incentives also apply to LFP cars. And as you mentioned, LFP is nickel-free, so it doesn't make sense for a government who has nickel as its advantage to be giving LFP cars incentives at the same level as nickel-based cars, right? So that incentive, that policy actually paved the way for Indonesia to adopt LFP electric cars. And that's why the government's goal to push for nickel-based EV ecosystem is now becoming more and more questionable.
And this came up in the election that it seems like both Prabowo, Jokowi, and Jokowi's son are all very pro-nickel, and that there's an association in Indonesian politics between being pro-nickel and pro-China in many respects. How did that play out in the campaign?
Yeah, so that was a very confusing and funny bit from a presidential debate not too long ago. They tried to frame nickel as pro-Indonesia or a really exclusively Indonesian thing, and then LFP at the opposite of the spectrum as anti-Indonesia or, pro-China. And I think that was just Gibran's, the vice president candidate's attempt to antagonize anything that is not nickel. And that was his attempt to play off this common rhetoric about foreign interventions. As you know, that foreign interventions, especially when it comes to China, can be very sensitive in Indonesia.
And so that really does put the government into a difficult position, because if they continue to align themselves with Chinese mining interests, then they might run afoul of the IRA, which could limit the ability to export sufficient amounts of nickel, particularly now when the price of nickel is so low. And there's been this move in the industry to cut back on production, cut back on exploration, because the price of nickel is in the tank right now. So that could have a long-term economic impact. But so this is going to be one of Prabowo's really big challenges, is finding that balance between the U.S. and China on nickel mining. Do you have any sense of how he's going to handle that?
Like I mentioned, I don't really know how Prabowo will handle that. If Prabowo turns out to be a more of a passive leader and just follow what Jokowi has done in the past 10 years, I think it will just look the same as the past decade. We will fail to move up further in nickel. Economically, we'll stay close to China, particularly in critical minerals, downstreaming like nickel. And so, it will just look more or less like this. We will just export intermediary nickel products and just call it a day, basically.
Well, one other issue that's worth addressing is the question of worker safety. This has been something that has been going on for years at Chinese-run mines, smelters, and various facilities in Indonesia, this question of worker safety and working conditions overall. This came to a lot of prominence at the end of last year, on Christmas Eve, in fact, when 21 people were killed at a Morowali Industrial Park smelter. And that really brought attention to this question of worker safety. The Indonesian government and Indonesian police named 2 Chinese nationals as suspects for negligence in all of this. I don't know if they've been arrested yet, but they certainly have been named as being negligent in the oversight of safety conditions at the smelter. Talk to us a little bit about the issue at large about mine safety and the fact that in Indonesia, they're putting blame in 2 different areas. At one hand, they're saying, okay, the Chinese companies are certainly responsible, but they're also frustrated with the fact that local governments are not enforcing labor and environmental laws as they should. And there's a lot of accountability on that side that needs to be answered for as well.
I think it's going to be easy to blame China when you hear that the police is charging 2 Chinese workers for the Morolai fire. But we have to keep in mind that if we're talking about accountability, it's definitely 100% in the company's jurisdiction to make sure that all workers are safe, and also the Indonesian government where the company is operating. We know that instead of enforcing the environmental laws and the environmental standards, the Indonesian government is involved in intimidating and suppressing protests from the workers whenever they are protesting about their working condition. So instead of helping the workers, helping the local communities to get justice and to get safety and security, the Indonesian government is prioritizing its investments and the company over the people.
And what do you think is going to be done about it?
If you ask me to be honest, I think there's nothing to be done about it. The government has already shown us their priority. And they have told us over and over again in national TVs, in all the interviews, that they are going to prioritize investments. And they just simply cannot connect the dots between taking environmental concerns seriously and pulling more investments. Because all the analysts that I talk to are basically saying, okay, if you want to do this properly, if you want to pull more investments, if you want to get more markets, this is what you have to do. You have to take the environmental concerns seriously, and then it will open up more markets and more opportunities for you. But I don't think the government is getting that, to be really honest with you.
And do you get any sense that the Chinese mines are any better or worse than the mines from other countries or even the Indonesian mines?
Better in what sense?
In safety, environmental issues, are they better or worse? I mean, we focus on the issue in the Chinese mines.
Yeah.
Put this in a context. Are the US, I know there's US mining companies in Indonesia. There are Indonesian mines. Are the Chinese better or worse than those from other countries? Do we have any sense of how they compare?
I don't think it's about who is better or who is worse. I think when we talk about Chinese mines or US mines or French mines, Australian mines, they all have the same impacts for the local communities. Really, it just comes down to the Indonesian government and how willing they are to enforce the standards, the environmental laws.
Okay, well, let's leave the conversation there. Do we have any sense about when Prabowo is probably going to be named president, when this process is going to finish? Any visibility on that?
If we look at the 2019 election, the official results were announced approximately a month after the election.
A month?
Yes.
My goodness.
So we could expect around the same timeline for this one.
Okay. Well, then we can probably expect a lot more jockeying like what we saw this weekend with Ambassador Lu Kang, and everybody is going to try and position themselves in Prabowo's good graces. That's something that we can definitely expect. Antonia, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. If you'd like to follow all of Antonia's work, you can go over to China Global South, and you can see her reporting right there on the front page. We've got a whole section of Southeast Asia news that Antonia is working on, and also she works very closely with a team of journalists around Southeast Asia on China stories in the region, and we have some great contributions from Thailand, from Cambodia, and others that Antonia edits. So we really appreciate all the great work that you're doing, Antonia. Let's leave the conversation there. If you want to join us every day to hear what Antonia is saying and also what Cobus and Giro and the rest of the team, the best way to do that is to sign up for a subscription to the China Global South Project. We really depend on your subscriptions to keep this operation going. It is an independent, agenda-free news operation that requires support. And so your subscriptions help. Go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe, and you can get very, very affordable subscriptions that start at $19 a month. And if you are a student or teacher, email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you a half-off link for the student academic discount. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. For Antonia Timmerman in Jakarta, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. We'll see you again next week.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.